We're here today to share some insights to Gateway 2 submissions. So I'm Craig Wells, Sales Director from Quelfire. So we manufacture and supply passive fire protection products with a very core focus on service penetration seals. And I'm very ably joined by a panel today from all aspects of the construction industry. So I'd like to ask Graeme to kick off with introducing himself and the organisation.
Thank you. Thanks, Craig. Graeme Whitty from Willmott Dixon. I'm the National Product Director, Principal Contractor on the scheme we're going to talk about.
Hi, everyone. James Felstead, Director at Graddon Lewis. We're architects. We work a lot in the residential sector and working with the team here on a project going through the Gateway.
I'm Tom Hughes from Sphere. We were fulfilling the principal designer role on this particular scheme.
And Jeremy Ockenden from Affinity Fire Engineers. So we were the fire engineers on this particular project.
Good. So as you can see, we've got a good cross section of experts, all with one common objective, and that is to design and then build a safe building. So. Graeme, would you like to kick off just telling us a little bit about the project, just to set the stage, as it were?
Yeah, certainly. So we're going to talk a bit about the Building Safety Act and then obviously how it our project met the Building Safety Act, and the two joined together. So hopefully, as we all know, Building Safety Act is a bit of legislation that came into force back in April 22. It set the foundation for building safety in the construction sector. And it amended the Building Act in 1984, and subsequent secondary legislation brought through all the changes that we now see and are dealing with. And I could spend the rest of this session just going through the Building Safety Act, but very quickly, it created the Building Safety Regulator and established its function in law. It established the concept of higher risk buildings and put in place a new system of gateways to control the planning, design and construction of these buildings. It also defined new responsibilities for accountable persons and created duty holders, the client, the principal contractor and the principal designer. And importantly, it requires all individuals and organisations working on projects to be able to demonstrate their competency to do so. And that's quite a key thing. There's lots of other little bits and bobs like golden thread, mandatory occurrence reporting and building control regulation, but we won't go into them. But if we focus on the higher risk buildings, then we've got the definition is a building above 18 metres in height or 7 stories that contains at least 2 residential units or as a hospital or as a care home. So that sort of positions these buildings, they are higher risk of life safety issues should anything happen. And it's for all elements of the building regulations, not just fire safety elements. And what the Building Safety Act did is created a separate pathway for these higher risk buildings to go through their planning, their design and their construction. And that's separate for standard non-HRB buildings, which keep going through the same pathway that we know through planning and building control. So the HRBs only go through these gateways, and the first one is at Gateway 1 is at planning. So at the planning stage, you have to demonstrate a basic understanding of the fire safety for that building in its planning application. So things like access for the fire brigade, number of stair cores, high-level design criteria like that. And once you've got planning, you then go into Gateway 2. And this is where the real change lies. A Gateway 2 submission is a detailed design submission demonstrating how that entire building complies with every aspect of building regulations. It's a fundamental difference from a set of planning drawings and some nice pretty elevations with a bit of text. It is a very in-depth design. It is time-consuming. It is costly to do, and it has been difficult for us to do. I'm not going to bear any bones about it. It has been a learning curve for us all. And that is a stop-go gateway. So you cannot start on sites without Gateway 2 being approved. So it's illegal to do so. So you have to get Gateway 2 approval. And then you move on to Gateway 3, which is fundamentally just demonstrating that you've delivered what you've set out to do in Gateway 2. So if you say it's going to be green in Gateway 2, it's got to be green when you deliver it in Gateway 3. And at the end of that, you get your completion certificates. And if you don't get your completion certificates, the end user can't occupy your building. So these gateways really control the flow of projects through the system for these higher risk buildings. So our project at the stage in Luton is a HRB. It's 3 large residential blocks. 2 of the blocks are linked together. It has 292 homes across the blocks and is 10 stories in height. So one could say it's a classic high-risk building in its conception. So we're working with the customer, Luton Borough Council, through the SCF framework, and that allowed us to get appointed to work up the detailed design and take the project through what is our first full Gateway 2 submission. So, we're definitely on a journey, us as a principal contractor, and obviously the team and our customer as well. So we had to then obviously choose a team, select our consultant partners who are going to work with us, and we've been used our existing supply chain, worked trusted partners who we know can deliver, have the competency to work on these types of buildings. We then obviously picked our principal designer with our employer, and the employer appointed the principal designer. And we could probably spend another half an hour talking about that, but probably for another session. But in my view, it's the right way to do it. But I'm sure other people have got different views. And we also selected some of our manufacturer partners. So when we're looking at the initial design, we're thinking we need to create our submission. We need that support, that CPD elements of design, contractor designed portions, and we need to name products. And when we're looking at naming products and naming systems to demonstrate to the regulator how those will comply, we go straight back to our supply chain system, our yellow book, our design bible, and our friends Quelfire are front and centre in that, have been a big supporter for what we're trying to do in understanding and getting better fire safety into our buildings. One of the key things that the team had to do was set up and decide what level of information we were going to finish at and submit to the regulator, and that's a difficult thing because there is no guidance out there. The regulator says give us everything, and it's like, well, what do you mean by everything? Because there's a lot, and that did cause us some problems, and still causing us problems now, and the challenges that we have to face. We effectively ended up making 2 separate submissions. So the 2 joined blocks is one submission, and the standalone block is a separate submission. That then went to the regulator with 2 sets of fees and all that good stuff, and ended up being looked at by one multidisciplinary team, but 2 separate fire engineers looking at it. And so we have 2 different sets of eyes looking at effectively the same design rationale, which we're still going through that process. We're quite interested to see how different people are looking at our evidence and our information and our explanation of our route to compliance. We ended up submitting over 900 documents that took several days physically to upload, so that as an administration task in itself, and not to be underestimated. We made our submission back in July, and then we held our breath for 12 weeks, which is the statutory period for determination for a Gateway 2. And then, as we fully expected, we got a request for an extension by the regulator for another 4 weeks and 6 weeks for the second one. And we were expecting this because if you remember in the press, they were dealing with some failures for building control bodies who have gone bust, and they had to step in and go and sort out live projects. So they said that they're going to have some struggle with capacity. So we're expecting this to happen. We obviously agreed to the extension, as I can't believe anyone wouldn't, because with the obvious outcome that you'll just get determined and rejected. And we received our first formal response from the regulator in early October, and now we're in dialogue with the parties, responding to their comments and queries, and are very hopeful for a positive result going forward.
Thank you, Graeme. It's a very good overview. And I guess it's fair to say you can't do it, as you've alluded to, without your supply chain, without your consultants and design team. Does anyone else want to chip in?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the obvious point is bringing forward that technical design much earlier into the process. Yeah. And I think that's going to lead to a fundamental shift to the way the procurement process works. Yeah. So I think maybe design teams and construction teams are probably at the first hit of that wave. But I think for the commercial teams that perhaps sit behind that there's a big learning curve for them and for clients in terms of what it's going to mean to procure a contractor, to procure services. So, I mean, the whole thing is a learning journey for everyone. But I think that pulling that detail into a much earlier time frame is a real fundamental shift.
Absolutely, yeah. Anything to add to that?
I think that's a really interesting point, talking about design and build. I think there's going to be a fundamental change in, it shouldn't really be about design as you build, it's design then build. And so I think that's going to be a challenge for the industry, but in some ways I think it's going to, certainly for principal contractors, probably going to de-risk projects, because you're going to have a lot more information to work with at the point of tendering. And so there will be a fundamental shift, and there will be some risk moving around, but fundamentally it should ultimately de-risk projects across the board.
Yeah, just to echo that you know, certainly as a fire engineer, one of the big frustrations with the industry has been designing to a fixed fact on the ground. You know, the building was being built, and where issues were raised by building control or even by the fire engineers, that it was too late and we were retrospectively trying to justify things. And actually having these gateways should be a massive benefit to the industry, but it is bringing a lot of extra burden to the whole process. You know, that you've really got to get all your ducks in the row. You've got to have all your information. You've got to have everything fully aligned before you ever even think about making that submission. So,
no, that's really good. And I think you alluded to it, Graeme, but this whole point about competency as well, probably a fundamental change there. So we can move on to competency. Obviously, there are a few different ways of discussing competency, but how do we measure it? What do we mean by competency?
Well, as principal designer, we have quite a lot to say about competence. It's one of the main challenges that we've found. So competence, so the duty for competence is enshrined in the building regs, and applies to, it's universal. So it applies to, from your small scale residential scheme right through to your huge HRBs, high rise offices, whatever it is. If the building regs apply, you have a duty to be competent and to demonstrate your competence. And that's been one of the biggest challenges that we found as the principal designer, is that it in the main falls to us to run through those competence assessments. And there can be some pushback sometimes, I think it's fair to say. I think sometimes there's a lack of understanding, and it's sometimes some frustration, I think, from design teams, which I do understand. But I think it's part of the benefit of it is, again, it's about de-risking your business. So it allows a lot of design practices to actually look inwardly at themselves and sort of interrogate a lot of your internal processes and your procedures and how you set plans for achieving compliance in your designs, and also for your CPD schemes as well. It allows you to really interrogate how you work as a business, and to de-risk it and to make sure that you're actually hitting the target for compliance before you even think about speaking to building control.
It's good. And I guess one of the models we use is the SCEB model, isn't it? The skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. Anyone want to give our audience a couple of minutes on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you alluded to it. I think it's quite natural you're being asked to demonstrate things that often you do and are embedded perhaps in the way in which you work and practice. And so there is an initial emotional reaction sometimes to sort of say, why do I have to demonstrate that? But I think once you can get past that, you realise the purpose of it. And I guess if I've got any advice for anybody here, even if you're not working on buildings going through Gateway now, but if you're likely to, I think start looking at this competency point now, because a lot of it is about demonstrating and documenting processes that you might already be doing. But I think also that spotlight being shined on it does sort of highlight areas where perhaps you could strengthen processes or strengthen training. That's certainly what we've found. But I think, get ahead of the curve, because there's a big admin burden that comes with the application generally. So I think if you can have that piece kind of there ready in advance, then that will help you massively.
That's good. And the behaviours aspect of it is often a challenging thing to measure, but for me, I think it's probably one of the most important things. You can have all the skills and knowledge and experience in the world, but if you don't want to do the right thing, it all falls flat. And not to make anything of Graeme and Willmott Dixon, but I think you see that throughout the organisation, that there's a culture of wanting to do things right and wanting to follow a process and it works really well. But I think anybody that's tried to change their culture in an organisation will know that it takes time. So there's no better time to start than now in terms of trying to, as you say, prove what you're doing, start documenting it. That's good, excellent. So if we move on, we've probably touched on some of these points, but what has the Building Safety Act changed? I think we've alluded to the fact that we're doing a lot of things that we might have done later on in the project, much earlier. Don't know who wants to kick off on this one.
I think it just has fundamentally changed the attitude. I think to a lot of people, it is design it and then go and build it to that design. You can't make changes on the hoof anymore with HRB. If it's a major change, the regulator has to agree that change before you can implement it. So it's some fundamental things like I'd have a piling obstruction. I can't change my piling design because it's part of my structural solution. I then have to go to the regulator to get them to agree my changed pile design. Things like that will cause us problems on site. In availability of a material that you've relied on in your submission. If it's not no longer on the market or whatever, that will create a change. If it depends on which one it is, if it's a major one, it will create a change, and it's out of our control. And our experience as a principal contractor is we make those changes, we deliver that, we drive it, and that is what our site leads do. They solve problems. And now you're asking them just to go and deliver the design on the page and not make any changes, not solve problems, and have to go round. And it's a fundamental change for how site teams work, definitely. But the front end, the procurement side of it, some people are saying is design and build dead as a contracting arrangement, and it will change and evolve. It will be different. It's not dead. It will just change into a different type of animal. It's going to be a bit more investment for customers up front, so they're going to have to spend more money at risk before they get a determination and approval. They're going to have to choose a contractor a lot earlier, so they can't play the game and drive lowest cost or the best value decisions. They're going to have to partner with someone because they need a contractor on board to be able to do the submission. They need to commit to consultants, commit to product suppliers a lot earlier. Fundamentally changes the current state of play. And our contracting arrangements don't really cover it. So all of the JCTs and things like that don't cover this very well at all. So lots of amendments, lots of work for the lawyers, and we're anticipating lots of problems in the future with this until we all have an understanding of how it's going to work in principle.
That's good. And I like the analogy, design, then build. So design and build might be dead, but design, then build. But it works. So that's good. Any more to add to that? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, just talking about procurement and having to sort of select a lot of products early doors. It does present some problems, I guess, in that you may be choosing a fire door 2 years before you actually need it, and in that 2 years that product may be discontinued, and so there are some challenges, I think, for the industry to figure out exactly where where to pitch the level of information they put in, and one of the things that we've come back from the regulator is talking about whether performance specifications are acceptable or not. And I think it's probably fair to say on the stage the sort of strategy that we employed was choose what we saw as the real sort of headline sort of contracted design portion elements to go into the submission, and performance spec a lot of other items. And not that I would necessarily always advocate that as being the correct strategy, but I think in this particular instance, I think that largely seems to have worked. But again, it's not always going to be a universal solution, but I think that's going to be one of the things that, as time goes on, and the regulator as well also learns about how they want to sort of function and how they, what they're willing to accept and not, then is that's where we'll sort of find a balance, but that's only going to come through time, realistically.
And I think you've alluded to this, Jeremy, but I guess ultimately this can actually relieve some pressure and stress. You're often getting called in as a fire engineer when there's a problem on site. Well, moving everything left on the programme, we've actually got time, space and adequate resource to do it properly.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And it does relieve pressure in that regard. I think where I was going to go was that by and large, the Building Safety Act, or certainly going to the new Building Safety Regulator, does or is slowly changing the way that we just approach demonstrating building control, building regulation compliance at all, in the fact that sort of in the before days, we would often go to building control and have that discussion and say, if we do these things, can we agree that this is demonstrating compliance with the building regulations? Whereas now the attitude is the design team has to come together and demonstrate compliance with the building regulations themselves, and we have to be absolutely rock solid, and there's no let's test the waters, let's see whether we can get away with this. And slowly the attitude is really changing for the positive, that we're actually, can we de-risk these items? Can we lower these items down as much as possible? And that should be the direction of travel. So that's a big positive, actually.
It's very helpful. So I guess we've touched on some of the challenges, the delays, etc. There's obviously lots of questions around the adequate resourcing of the building safety regulator and so on. Don't want to dwell on the negatives too much, but is there anything we need to acknowledge?
I think maybe the one thing to acknowledge is that period of transition. So we're talking about this should lead to a better process of working, and I think everyone's in agreement about that. But I think it'd be naive to think we're just going to step into that world. Clients are used to appointing contractors, consultants around fee structures and programs. You've got projects that have undergone viability assessments based around programs and cost levels that are all going to be different. And so I think we're in for 2 or 3 years of quite hard lessons that we're all going to have to learn. And I'm sure the outcome eventually will be positive. Yeah. But I think people should brace themselves for some hard work along the way, I think, is the reality. Sorry, not to be negative, but... Okay, let's move on to positives and successes. So, as we've said, we've got a team here, all been involved in the same project and other projects, of course. Any key positives that we can take away? And
well, I think any sort of collaboration is a positive. I don't think it's ever worked negatively when you get the team of the right people together with a common goal. Yeah. But it's having the ability to do that and the common drive, understanding that you can't do it on your own. So we have got some good ideas about how we put buildings together, but we're not architects, we're not fire engineers, we're not structural engineers. We need all of that support being brought in, that specialism. And you need to work as a team. It's like construction is a team exercise. There's no one does it all on their own. But I think it's early collaboration would be rather than bringing people in right at the last minute to either sort out problems, which is not really collaboration, is it? So the collaboration is designing out the common issues, understanding all the myriad of different factors that need to be thought about and solved on a project, and coming up with the optimal solution. And it's a balancing act, and there's no one right way of doing it, and you can only get to the right solution for the project in consultation with the full team, and that's what collaboration is. Bit of give and take.
It's good. Far away. Collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, I think, sort of amplifying what I was saying earlier, I think it is that sort of end vision of where we're trying to get to. I'm sure I wasn't alone in, hearing the sort of outcomes of the Grenfell inquiry is pretty hard. Working in this industry, it's pretty critical of what the whole industry kind of did. And I think, I'm sure my experience is the same as many people here. You work with lots of really talented, dedicated people who are genuinely trying to do the right thing. But I think that what the inquiry highlighted very clearly was some absolute systemic issues in the way in which we as an industry design and deliver buildings. And sometimes that's quite hard as an individual to feel, how can you shift that? Because there's this big system of the way things work. So for me, I think the big positive of this is it is really trying to shift the way in which the whole system works. And I think I'm hopeful that will give the whole industry the right platform to actually deliver much safer buildings and work in a much more positive way. So that's the way we're seeing it.
I think one of the key things just to always remember as well is that ultimately we are building people's homes, we're designing people's homes. And so one of the things that we've always tried to sort of drill into a lot of design teams and a lot of clients as well is that you actually, as much as we need to think about and just be really focused on getting through Gateway 2, is that you actually already at this stage need to be thinking about getting through Gateway 3 as well, because it's all interconnected. You need to be thinking about the people that are going to be living in these buildings right from day one, from the first time that you even commission a feasibility study. And so that's where things like some of the new prescriptive documents, such as the fire and emergency file, where is really sort of trying to drill down into management arrangements for the people that are going to live in these buildings, is that it can become quite easy to be sort of hyper focused on Gateway 2 and almost just see Gateway 3 as this kind of distant destination, but you kind of already need to be thinking about where you're trying to get to from day one. Sorry.
Just to add to that, I guess, I mean, it's on quite a specific topic, but the importance of considering the management of the building at Gateway 2 is becoming really, really highlighted, particularly for fire, but I'm sure across the board. I think that, again, there used to be a tendency to think, oh, well, we'll sort out the management when we get to the occupation of the building, and that the building will be properly managed. That's not good enough for the building safety regulator. Building controls, building safety regulator want full consideration. So that collaboration is not just between the design team, but it's back to the client, it's back to the person who's going to be operating the building. It's absolutely critical, and we're finding that across the board. So
it's good. So an expression we sometimes use is about building a champion team, not a team of champions, isn't it? So I think we'd all own that we're all specialists in our own field, and it requires all that knowledge to come together with the right behaviours to work collaboratively. So it's so important, isn't it? Good. If we move on briefly to key learning outcomes, so I guess we've touched on a few of them as we go. But I think one of the fundamental things that's coming through it all is evidence. It is all about the evidence, isn't it? We were talking earlier about the answer that you provide isn't just enough. You've got to show your workings.
Yeah, it's. I think one of the key lessons is time as well. This does take time. It can't be rushed. There's certain processes you have to go through, and you need to be clear about your decision-making processes as well. So when you make a decision, unpicking that and leaving it all woolly, that unpicks loads of work. So that just takes time away from the teams. You need to be clear on your decisions, clear on how you're going to go forward as a team, whether that's the management strategy from the client and the end user, our choice of frame construction or whatever, or the fire strategy that we're going to follow. These need to be clearly thought about, and once we're on that path, you stick to it unless there's a fundamental change. But it's really being clear about your decisions, and it does take a lot longer than you think. I think is what we've learned. It's regardless of the determination in time for the regulator. Every project has key dates that you have to hit, and we've got an end date to hit, so everything just gets concertinaed up, and time is one of the resources that we need to be thinking about as well. So these things can't be rushed.
I think one of the other lessons we're starting to get from initial feedback is very much about communication and the style and language of how you present information. I think is subtly different to how you might present similar information in, say, a building control application or through the planning process. So it's a regulatory process that you're probably familiar with, but I think there is a subtle shift in, I think you touched on it earlier, Tom, about the burden, or Jeremy maybe, the burden of demonstrating compliance very much falls back on the team. So I think that changes how you've got to communicate and articulate the technicality of your design. There's a lot more hand-holding, saying this is how we're doing it, this is where it's shown on these drawings or in these clauses. So you've got to be really, really, really specific, more than you might imagine. Whatever you imagine, times it by 10, and then that might just be enough.
Yeah, again, it's coming down to being just very, very explicit and very clear. And I think that again comes back to allowing or sort of pushing designers to be sort of introspective about their designs and really, for example, using the building regs compliance statements, which is one of the new HRB prescriptive documents that has to be submitted as a part of the Gateway 2 application, is it sort of forces you to actually go through the guidance almost line by line and to make sure that you kind of hit every area and ticked every box to make sure that you're actually covering that. And as Graeme said, like, you're showing you're working out, and that's the most important thing. Is you do have to be very clear and very explicit to the regulator, but that again, realistically, should de-risk it for us as the design team to make sure that we actually have considered everything that we do need to be considering.
I think probably the most hard-won lesson from our side is consistency of information, and not just what we're producing, but what is being produced off the back of fire safety information. So, if there are subcontractor trades coming on, sprinklers, smoke control specialists, etc., I think we've already found that if there's any inconsistency in the way that things are being described, that is because these packages are now all being looked at in one go, and you don't have that opportunity to necessarily go back and provide the clarification of, this was put in error. If that inconsistency is in there, then you're just resetting the clock on yourself, and you need to be super careful with consistency and give yourself the time to make sure you've got it.
And I think with my consultant hat on, and there's quite a few consultants in the audience, you need to think about the cost of this. It's a lot of time, as I'm sure you're kind of gathering from what we're saying. This all takes a lot of time. So I think there's an education process with clients to understand, I know there will be a cost to each of you to carry out that role. So, think about it carefully in terms of your fee proposals.
So I guess what we're saying is we need more and more education, sort of further up the food chain, as it were. Yeah. Again, it comes down to that fundamental principle of calibration, but also, open, transparent relationships. Graeme, you referred to how you work with your design teams, your suppliers, etc. It has to be a two-way conversation to continue on this journey and continuously improving. Excellent. Anyone wants to add to that? Key learning outcomes from the project or the process, or shall we throw the floor open to questions? There'll probably be a tsunami, but we're ready for it. There should be a roaming mic, I believe. Yeah, excellent.
Hi. You mentioned the importance of kind of thinking about Gateway 3 and I was wondering how you considered practical completion, and whether or not you're intending on piecing the project when your Gateway 3 goes in, or when it's approved, or at some other point.
Our approach is making sure that we've got all of that evidence trail from the earliest opportunity. So as soon as we finish a package, we're collecting, if it's fire life safety, it's the Regulation 38 information or the O&M information. So we've got that evidence trail that we have done it, and we're going back, and then we're tracking back to what was agreed in Gateway 2. So if we said it's going to be green, is it green now? And if it's not, and we've got that full audit trail going through the system. But it's a huge piece of work, and it's only going to get bigger. The evidencing that our teams are collecting to demonstrate that we have built and compliance with the design is huge now, much bigger than it's ever before. It's taking over people's day jobs on site managers. Their role is changing, evolving. They are evidence collators, and that's the way it has to be. We have to be able to demonstrate that we have put that fire barrier in that wall 22 stories up a building in 10 years' time, when all the teams disappeared. All that knowledge has gone. The evidence has to stand up on its own. And that's a huge piece of work for us to do, which helps us get our completion certificate. So that's one of the big key things they're looking for.
Hi there. Just wondered, when you talked about programme, obviously the Gateway 2 submission, the time it takes, 12 weeks plus extension. Was that factored in when the client came to you originally, that the programme could potentially be longer? Because obviously everyone's got an end date, and then normally when things happen early stages, you get squashed on the actual construction programme, which you can't necessarily just fast forward. So just wondered how that was managed.
I may have given the answer away already. No, is the short version of that. No, and I think this is where the whole process is a learning journey for everybody, and I think there's a real massive challenge around the unknown element of that program, because if you think about where it comes in a project as well, it's really tricky. You're deep into technical design, but you've not closed everything out. You've got a contractor itching, ready to get on site, I'm going to mobilise a huge team once they get the okay. But when's that going to come? And you've just got no idea. And if you get a no, does that mean you're right back to the beginning and there's another 3-4 months? And so I think it's not just design teams and contractors and clients, it's also investors. So if you take a step back and you look at our industry, you know, the investment world's looking at this and going, not sure we love this, what does this mean? And set against, you know, the challenges we've got, wider economics and the need for growth, that's a bit of a concern, I've got to say. I think we're just going to have to see how it plays out, yeah.
I just want to add something on program on a slightly more sort of granular level. One of the things that we often sort of advise our clients, not necessarily to give all our secrets away, but it's actually, we tend to find that it's actually better to spend a little bit more time at the front end and extend the program, the front end in the design phase to make sure your design is more coordinated and more complete. Because ultimately, and the BSR has said this, like the better and the better quality of the application, the less time you'll spend in Gateway 2. And so actually you might spend an extra 4 weeks at the front end designing, but that may mean you actually spend 6-8 weeks less stuck in Gateway 2. And so actually that can be quite painful, particularly for clients. But for, you know, sort of the end game, you actually should end up as a benefit.
And then once you get to site, you can potentially run faster, move faster, and less rework, which I'm sure is in everyone's interest.
Yeah, and less change control.
Exactly. Yeah. Another question?
Yes, sorry, just with the requirement to have a sort of named contractor from sort of early stages leading into Gateway 2, you sort of touched on best value. How do you sort of ensure best value from a sort of costing perspective if the design hasn't sort of evolved to a level of detail?
I think it's an iterative process. So you agree a cost envelope that's within customer's budget for what you believe it to be, using our experience and you know, PQS help and assistance, and then you finesse it, and you'll have wins and loses. You'll make some gains and losses. The design will change and flex, and you have to keep that dialogue. Cost is always a sensitive issue when it comes to customers, especially with, you know, public sector bodies. They don't have a lot of money sloshing around. They can't generally go back and ask for loads more funds if things massively change. But it's about having that open dialogue. It's like we know the cost parameters that make the project viable for the customer, and we're striving to achieve that. Is lowest cost the best value? Probably not. I think history tells us that, because you pay for risk. So I'd rather have the best overall value for the project, have the lowest element of risk that we can do, and every part of the chain is predictable, from the clients to ourselves to our customers, and obviously the subcontractors out on site delivering the work. So everyone knows that's what we're going to be going and do. I've got 20 weeks to go and do it. I've got all the information I need. Crack on. And then you're just a subject to the British weather. That's all you are.
Do you think this Gateway 2 process restricts innovative design of buildings where you might need a complex fire engineered solution? You know, does the BSR have the expertise in-house to assess that complex solution?
Yeah, I've got to say this is something I'm genuinely really quite concerned about, because I think, you know, one of the natural kind of ways in which this could go is down a highly prescribed, standardized solution to everything. And I think there will be an element of that. I think there's an inevitability about that. But I think, you know, I have to say this as a designer, I appreciate there might be different views, but I think the world would be a poorer place if that's where we end up, everything standardized. I think, you know, so I think this is where I'm hopeful that there's going to be a learning process with the BSR as well, because I think the point about change and things that don't just slot right into the box, there has to be a process to have some dialogue about that and interrogate that and take that solution through. So I'm hopeful that the process will mature to allow that, because otherwise, yeah, I think we're going to get a lot of standardized repetition, and that's not a good thing.
Yeah, no, if I can just jump in on that. Yeah, it's, as a fire engineer, it's huge concern for us as an industry. We don't really know what dealing with complex fire engineered solutions is going to look like. One of the features, I guess, of dealing with the building safety regulator is that they're a bit of a black box. You don't know who you're dealing with, you don't know who the submission's going to, and you don't know what viewpoint they're likely to take, and whether they're even going to have the expertise to take on that very complex engineered argument. And so it's a huge sort of concern. And I would say that particularly where we're talking about large residential buildings or high-risk buildings, that the guidance really does only go so far, and that we should be looking to, actually getting back to the basic principles and asking, have we complied with the building regulations? And just hewing to guidance, particularly on very tall buildings, should not be seen as the correct response. And if that's where we end up going as an industry, I would be personally very disappointed, and I think it would be a big step backwards. So,
yeah.
Hello.
Guess we've got time for a few more.
Given I'm here. Hello.
Sorry.
Given that the legislation suggests that the principal designer should be the designer in control of the design, I'm just interested in why it's not the architect who's performing the principal designer role and it's gone to a separate entity.
I think there's pros and cons between. I think I understand that when the principal designer role was first being talked about, the idea was that it was to be the architect as the lead consultant in control of the design. I think principal designers, certainly the guys in our team, in the main, come from a building control background, and having the sort of building regs expertise, which not to do anybody in the team a disservice, but to have that sort of deep regulatory and sort of knowledge of the guidance and of the approved documents, for example, it just allows us to have to act as a sort of a role of sort of checks and balances. So in the competence guidance, PAS 8671 says that the role of the principal designer is not just to collate the claims of the design team on compliance. We should actually be able to interrogate and assess and challenge them as well to achieve a consensus on compliance. And so that's where I think a third party, particularly from a sort of building control background, really has a good role to play in being able to really interrogate the sort of compliance arguments that the design team are making.
I guess you can overwrite it with accountability, can't you? You've got great designers, but it's someone having that overall control, ensuring that each of the design teams within it is doing what's correct. It's good. Question from Neville.
If you go back 30 years or so, when a product was specified, it was installed. It then moved towards product or similar. Then it moved towards performance. With Gateway 2, it's going back to a product gets specified. Does the team believe it actually will get installed, bearing in mind the pressures of certification, availability and price?
If I've got anything to do with it, yes, because that's my job, to make sure that our teams procure and deliver what is put on the drawing. And if a change happens, because you're forced to make a change, you've got all the audit process to make sure that the replacement material or the solution design meets the criteria, and you've got the evidence trail there. Before, it was left, a surveyor making a decision based on price and from what a supply chain partner's telling them. And it's like, well, that's great, fantastic. Show me the evidence. And now there's a big cost and time associated to making a change on a HRB that for a few £1,000 saving on a material, just not worth doing anymore. So I know what material we designed. We should have priced that. We're going to go and deliver that now. And there's a great upheaval, just a lot of work, let alone the cost and time associated with that to get small, simple changes through. Big fundamental ones are going to have to go back through the design team and then back to the regulator before you can even do them. So it's going to stop ad hoc changes on site, which is only a good thing. So someone's run out of the type of fixing that's specified, great, they're going to have to wait until the new ones turn up. They're not going to use what's in the back of the van and cause absolute havoc going forwards.
Thank you. More to think about projects which involve existing buildings. So do you think that kind of the age of making reasonable assumptions is over in the initial design stage?
that's something that we're dealing with a lot on. We have quite a few facade remediation schemes, and yeah, sort of going into Gateway 2 with assumptions made in the design is certainly a risk, and so we are trying to sort of fill those gaps where we can, and I think where the advice that we've given to the design teams and to the clients on those particular schemes is where there is where we are making an assumption, then we need to just be as robust as we can in why we believe that assumption is correct, and also offer up a solution if that assumption turns out to be incorrect. And I think that goes back to what we were saying earlier about just being very explicit in showing your decision-making process and sort of showing your working out in when you're making that argument and presenting your case to the regulator is just to be very, very clear as to how you've arrived at that assumption, what the implications might be, whichever way your sort of assumption goes, and that you have a plan in place should you be incorrect.
There's a very clear drive towards retrofit and retention. You're seeing it in policies, you're seeing it in local governments changing policies that I think Westminster recently. So there's a clear direction of travel there, and I think the industry and the regulator are going to have to find a way to work through that, because that direction of travel and that drive in that direction is not going to let up. So I think this is where an evolution of the process will kind of follow, I hope.
And the definition of a high-risk building could change as well. And so, good. Thank you for those questions. It's been excellent. And thank you very much to the panel for joining us today. I think that's been very insightful. Hopefully you got some good takeaways from that you can take away and think about and hopefully implement, because the key is in the execution, isn't it, and change. So once again, thank you very much for attending London Build and listening to us today. Thank you.